Elias jolted awake. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. A cold sweat clung to him, clammy and unsettling. He tried to wipe his brow, but his hand met empty air. He couldn't feel it. Panic swelled in his chest, a suffocating pressure. He sat up, his eyes darting around the darkened lab. The only light came from the flickering glow of his computer monitor, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. He tried to call out, but his voice was a strangled whisper in the silence. Where was he? What had happened? The last thing he remembered was the blinding flash of lightning that had plunged the lab into darkness. Had he been struck? Had he imagined the whole thing? He stumbled to his feet, his legs feeling weak and unsteady. He fumbled for his phone on the desk, his fingers passing through the solid object as if it was smoke. He recoiled, his breath catching in his throat. This couldn't be real. He staggered towards the small mirror hanging on the wall, his heart pounding in his ears. His reflection should be there, staring back at him with wide, terrified eyes. But there was nothing. Only the reflection of the empty lab, cold and sterile. A wave of dizziness washed over him. He gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. He was invisible. But how? Why? The silence in the lab was deafening. The hum of the computer seemed to amplify the emptiness echoing in his ears. He reached out, his hand passing through the cold metal of the desk. No sensation, no feeling. He was adrift in a sea of nothingness, his own body a foreign entity. He closed his eyes, willing himself to wake up from this nightmare. But when he opened them again, the lab was still there, dark and silent, and he was still invisible. The air grew heavy, charged with an unseen energy. He could feel it prickling at his skin, raising goosebumps along his arms. Something was terribly wrong. He pressed his fingers against his throat, searching for the reassuring thump of his pulse. Was he dead? Was this what it felt like to be a ghost? He couldn't be dead. He could feel the cold floor beneath his bare feet. He could smell the faint scent of ozone in the air. He was still here, trapped. He moved through the lab like a phantom, his movements hesitant, unsure. He bumped into a stool, sending it crashing to the floor. The sound was jarring in the silence, a stark reminder of his own spectral existence. He had to find a way out of this. He had to find someone who could help him. But who would believe him? Who could help an invisible man? The storm raged outside, the wind howling like a banshee. Rain lashed against the windows, blurring the lights of the city beyond. The storm had been violent, the sky torn apart by jagged bolts of lightning. One of those bolts, it had to be connected to his current state. He remembered the blinding flash, the searing pain that had shot through his body. Then, nothing. Blankness. Until he woke up like this, a prisoner in his own body. Had the lightning somehow altered him, transformed him into something else? A shiver ran down his spine, though he couldn't feel it. He was a stranger to himself, a ghost in his own life. A world without reflection. He moved to the window, pressing his hand against the cool glass. The city lights blurred through the rain, a kaleidoscope of colours dancing before his eyes. He could see them, but they couldn't see him. He was a ghost, a phantom, invisible to the world. A wave of loneliness washed over him, cold and relentless. He was cut off from everything he knew, adrift in a sea of shadows. He was alone, utterly alone. He had to find a way to reverse this. He had to find a way to become visible again. He couldn't stay trapped like this, a ghost in his own life. Lost in transmission. He reached out to his computer, his fingers passing through the keyboard. He had to find answers. He had to understand what had happened to him. He typed, his fingers moving effortlessly through the solid keys. But the words on the screen remained unchanged. He couldn't interact with the digital world either. He was cut off, isolated, a prisoner in his own invisible world. His breath caught in his throat, a sob rising in his chest. He was trapped with no way out. He slammed his fist against the desk, the sound echoing in the silence. Frustration welled up inside him, a bitter taste in his mouth. He needed to think. He needed a plan. The Spectre of Doubt. He paced the length of the lab, his bare feet silent on the cold floor. He had to be logical about this. There had to be a scientific explanation. He was a scientist, after all. He dealt in facts, not in the supernatural. But what if there was no logical explanation? What if this was beyond science? What if he was truly a ghost? The thought sent a shiver down his spine, though he couldn't feel it. He was losing himself in the fear, in the unknown. He had to focus. He had to find a way out of this, out of... Alone in the void. As the storm raged outside, Elias stood alone in the darkness of his lab, a ghost in his own world. He was invisible, intangible, a prisoner in his own body. The silence was deafening, broken only by the pounding of his own heart. He was lost in a void of his own making, the world he knew fading with each passing moment. He was alone, and he was terrified. He closed his eyes, drawing in a shuddering breath. He had to be strong. He had to find a way out of this. He had to believe that there was still hope. But deep down, a cold dread settled in his gut. He was a ghost, and ghosts, he knew, didn't have happy endings.